Good evening. Let me begin tonight with a question that should keep every foreign policy strategist awake at night. While the world spent the better part of 3 years fixated on the dramatic spectacle of kinetic warfare, on missile trajectories and frontline advances, on sanctions packages and diplomatic ultimatums, one country was methodically, patiently, and almost invisibly repositioning itself to emerge as the undisputed strategic winner of the entire geopolitical upheaval. That country is China. I want to be very precise about what I mean by winning. I am not suggesting that Beijing orchestrated these conflicts, nor that it wished for the suffering they produced. What I am arguing with considerable evidence is that the People's Republic of China executed a strategy of disciplined restraint, opportunistic positioning, and long term structural investment that has left it, by virtually every measurable metric of national power, in a stronger position than it occupied before the wars began. And it accomplished this without firing a single shot in any of the conflicts that reshaped the international order. This is not the first time in history that a major power has profited from the conflicts of others. The United States emerged from both world wars vastly stronger than it entered them, precisely because it allowed the existing great powers to exhaust themselves before stepping in decisively. What makes China's case remarkable is the sophistication of the strategy and the breadth of the domains in which it has advanced: energy, technology, diplomacy, finance, and institutional influence. Let us examine each in turn. Is the energy revolution building the post-fossil world while others fought over the old one. If you want to understand how profoundly the global power structure has shifted, start with energy. While Western nations imposed sanctions on Russian oil and gas, scrambled to secure alternative supplies, and watched energy prices devastate their industrial bases and consumer confidence, China was executing the most ambitious energy transition in human history. The numbers are staggering. By the end of 2025, China had invested over $625 billion in clean energy in a single year, representing roughly a third of the global total. Its clean energy sector drove more than a third of the country's entire GDP growth. Renewable energy sources made up 36% of regional power generation in 2024, and by the first half of 2025, solar generation alone had grown by 43% year over year. The country had achieved its 2030 wind and solar capacity target 6 years ahead of schedule. But here is the truly critical point, and I want you to understand this because it is the foundation of everything else I will argue tonight. China did not merely build renewable capacity for domestic consumption. It systematically established near monopoly control over every link in the clean energy supply chain, from the mining and processing of rare earth elements and critical minerals to the manufacturing of solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and electric vehicles. When we talk about energy dominance in the 21st century, we are no longer talking about who controls the oil fields. We are talking about who controls the factories that produce the technologies the entire world needs to decarbonize. And that country is China. Consider electric vehicles. More than half of all passenger vehicles sold in China in 2025 were electric. China is not merely consuming these vehicles domestically, it is exporting them globally, from Europe to Brazil, from Southeast Asia to the Middle East. The country's dominance in battery technology means that even Western automakers who wish to compete must rely on Chinese manufactured components. The new three of Chinese economic growth, electric vehicles, batteries, and solar panels, have replaced the old export model of cheap consumer goods with high-value strategic commodities that will define the 21st century economy. While Europe spent hundreds of billions managing its energy crisis, and the United States gutted clean energy tax credits in its latest spending legislation, China was investing 4 times as much in clean energy as it was in fossil fuel extraction. This is not an accident. This is grand strategy executed at industrial scale. 2. The diplomatic windfall, quiet positioning while others burned bridges. Now let us turn to diplomacy, where China's gains have been equally remarkable, if less quantifiable. The geopolitical upheaval of 2022 through 2026 created what I would call a diplomacy of distraction. The major Western powers, led by the United States, were consumed by the management of multiple simultaneous crises: the war in Ukraine, the conflict in Gaza, and broader Middle Eastern instability, rising tensions with Iran, the situation in Venezuela, and internal political turbulence. Every unit of diplomatic energy spent on these crises was a unit not spent on managing the long-term strategic challenge posed by China's rise. Beijing exploited this vacuum with extraordinary precision. While Washington was deploying carrier strike groups to the Caribbean and managing simultaneous confrontations in the Middle East, China was deepening economic partnerships across Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia through the Belt and Road Initiative. It was signing new trade agreements, investing in port infrastructure, building telecommunications networks, and training the next generation of political elites in developing nations through exchange programs and institutional partnerships. The European Council on Foreign Relations conducted a major global survey in late 2025, and the findings were remarkable. Favorable views of China were rising across virtually every country surveyed, while the perception of the United States as a reliable ally had declined in nearly all nations polled. Only India still had a majority viewing the United States as a genuine ally sharing their values and interests. The report concluded in rather stark language that the West appeared to be a diminishing geopolitical force for the foreseeable future. What makes China's diplomatic gains particularly durable is their structural nature. Beijing did not gain influence through temporary crisis diplomacy or military interventions that create resentment. It gained influence by building infrastructure, offering loans, purchasing commodities, and presenting itself as a reliable long-term economic partner, unconcerned with the internal governance arrangements of its partners. This is the no-strings-attached development model, and whatever its critics may say about debt dependency, it has proven extraordinarily effective at building political goodwill across the global South. Latin America offers perhaps the most striking example of this dynamic. As Washington escalated its confrontation with Venezuela, imposed blockades, and deployed naval assets to the Caribbean, China quietly deepened its economic engagement across the entire continent. Beijing secured observer status in the Andean community, expanded its Belt and Road partnerships, and became an increasingly central issue in national elections from Chile to Honduras. The irony is exquisite. Every American warship positioned off the Venezuelan coast was a recruiting poster for Chinese economic diplomacy. Governments across Latin America watched Washington's coercive approach and drew the obvious conclusion. Diversifying partnerships toward Beijing offered insurance against finding themselves on the receiving end of similar treatment. A similar pattern played out in Africa, where the combination of Western aid cuts and Chinese infrastructure investment created a stark contrast. While the Trump administration slashed foreign development assistance to levels not seen in decades, China continued to present itself as a development partner willing to invest in roads, railways, ports, and digital infrastructure. The contrast was not lost on African leaders navigating their own domestic pressures and looking for partners who would deliver tangible economic results without attaching governance conditions. Third, the institutional long game reshaping global governance from within. Perhaps the most underappreciated dimension of China's quiet victory is its systematic expansion within international institutions and governance frameworks. While the United States, under the current administration, has openly criticized the United Nations, reduced foreign aid from over $63 billion to potentially as low as $8 billion, and embraced a philosophy of transactional unilateralism, China has positioned itself as the defender of multilateralism. This is deeply ironic, and I want you to appreciate the strategic brilliance of the maneuver. For decades, the liberal international order was understood as an American project, American designed, American led, American funded. The institutions of global governance, the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, were instruments of American soft power. Now, as Washington openly disdains these institutions, China steps forward as their champion. Beijing can present itself with considerable credibility in much of the world as the only major power still genuinely committed to multilateral cooperation. At the same time, China has been building parallel institutional architecture. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank, the expanding BRICS framework, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. These are not replacements for the Western-led order. They are supplements and alternatives that give nations options, and options mean leverage. When a developing country can choose between an IMF structural adjustment program and a Chinese infrastructure loan, the geopolitical calculus shifts dramatically. Furthermore, China's growing dominance in critical minerals has given it institutional leverage of an entirely different kind. Beijing's willingness to use export controls on rare earth elements and critical minerals processing as a geopolitical tool put the world on notice in 2025. This is not merely an economic weapon, it is a governance tool. When you control the materials that every other nation needs to build its technological future, you have a form of structural power that no number of aircraft carriers can counterbalance. IV, the technology card, strategic self-sufficiency as national security. Let me turn now to what I consider the most consequential arena of all, technology. While Western sanctions were designed to contain China's technological development, they had a paradoxical effect. Sanctions became the most powerful accelerant of Chinese technological self-sufficiency in history. Cut off from advanced semiconductors, China invested hundreds of billions in domestic chip fabrication, denied access to Western AI frameworks. Chinese firms developed their own. Barred from purchasing certain defense technologies, the indigenous defense industry innovated at unprecedented speed. The Chinese cargo ship Istanbul Bridge that docked at the British port of Felixstowe in October 2025 illustrated another dimension of this technological ambition. It was the first major Chinese cargo vessel to travel directly to Europe via the Arctic Ocean, completing the journey in 20 days, weeks faster than traditional routes through the Suez Canal. Beijing described the voyage as a breakthrough for supply chain stability, but the real message was about China's expanding strategic reach into entirely new domains. In artificial intelligence, quantum computing, hypersonic weapons, space technology, robotics, and advanced manufacturing, China is no longer merely catching up. In several of these fields, it is leading. Its humanoid robot industry, showcased at the inaugural World Humanoid Robot Games in Beijing in August 2025, demonstrated capabilities that surprised even seasoned Western analysts. The clean energy technology sector alone contributed more than 10% of China's GDP in 2024, making it not merely a strategic asset, but a central pillar of the economy. The lesson here is fundamental. The wars and sanctions of this era were designed, at least in part, to preserve the existing technological hierarchy with the United States and its allies at the top. Instead, they created the conditions under which China was forced to, and ultimately succeeded in, building independent technological ecosystems that reduce its vulnerability to Western pressure. This is perhaps the greatest strategic miscalculation of the early 21st century. Consider, too, the space domain. China and Russia have positioned their International Lunar Research Station as a direct alternative to the American-led Artemis program and the Artemis Accords. While the scientific merits are debatable, the geopolitical message is unmistakable. China is offering the world an alternative in every domain, from terrestrial infrastructure to outer space. For nations that feel excluded from or uncomfortable with American-led frameworks, Beijing provides a different door to walk through. And with each passing year, as China's technological capabilities mature, that alternative becomes more credible and more attractive. V. The financial architecture quietly building an alternative. I would be remiss if I did not address the financial dimension of China's quiet victory. The weaponization of the SWIFT financial messaging system and the dollar-based sanctions regime against Russia sent an unmistakable signal to every non-Western government. The global financial system can be used as a weapon. And if you find yourself on the wrong side of Washington's politics, you can be cut off from the world economy overnight. China heard this message louder than anyone. The push to internationalize the renminbi, to develop alternative payment systems, and to encourage bilateral trade in local currencies accelerated dramatically after 2022. The BRICS nations, including Brazil, India, and South Africa, none of whom are adversaries of the United States, have expressed support for alternative payment mechanisms and the adoption of local currencies in bilateral trade. Russia and Iran, under heavy Western sanctions, have abandoned the dollar entirely in their trade with China. Now, I want to be careful here. The dollar remains the world's dominant reserve currency, and it will not be displaced overnight. China's renminbi internationalization has encountered setbacks, and capital controls limit its attractiveness as a freely traded global currency. But the direction of travel is clear. Every sanctions package, every frozen asset, every economic coercion reinforces the incentive for nations to develop alternatives. And China is the primary architect of those alternatives. Each crack in the dollar system is a brick in the edifice China is constructing. 6A's, the strategic patience doctrine, what the West failed to understand. Let me conclude with a broader observation about strategic culture. The wars of this era were fought under the logic of immediacy, immediate threats requiring immediate responses, measured in news cycles and election cycles. China operated under a fundamentally different temporal logic, one rooted in what I call the strategic patience doctrine. Beijing did not need to win any particular battle. It needed only to avoid losing, to maintain internal stability, to keep growing economically, and to let the existing powers exhaust themselves in conflicts that consumed their resources, divided their alliances, and distracted their attention. While Russia bled in Ukraine and the United States stretched its military across multiple theaters, while European unity fractured under the weight of defense spending debates and energy crises, China built. It built solar farms and battery factories. It built ports and railways. It built diplomatic relationships and institutional alternatives. It built the future. The ancient Chinese strategic tradition has always understood that the supreme excellence in warfare consists not in winning battles, but in achieving one's objectives without fighting. By this standard, China's performance over the past 4 years represents a masterclass in grand strategy. The country enters 2026 with greater confidence than at any point in the past decade, technologically more self-sufficient, diplomatically more influential, economically more diversified, and institutionally more embedded in the governance structures of the developing world. Conclusion: the implications for global order. So, where does this leave us? I want to be clear that I am not predicting the imminent collapse of American power or the inevitable rise of a Chinese dominated world order. History is never that simple, and China faces formidable challenges of its own: demographic decline, real estate fragility, tensions with Taiwan, and the inherent contradictions of maintaining authoritarian control over an increasingly sophisticated economy and society. What I am arguing is that the geopolitical upheavals of 2022 through 2026 have fundamentally accelerated a structural shift in global power that was already underway, and that China has been the principal beneficiary of this acceleration. The wars did not create China's rise, but they supercharged it. They created the conditions of distraction, exhaustion, and institutional erosion within which Beijing's long-term strategy could operate with maximum effectiveness. For policymakers in Washington, Brussels, and other Western capitals, the implications are sobering. The traditional toolkit of containment, sanctions, technology denial, alliance management, military deterrence, has proven insufficient against a competitor that understood the game was not about military confrontation, but about structural economic positioning. You cannot sanction a country into weakness when that country controls the supply chains you depend on. You cannot contain a technological rival when your own policies accelerate its drive towards self-sufficiency. You cannot lead a coalition of democracies when your own behavior undermines the institutional norms that gave that coalition its moral authority. The path forward for the West, if it wishes to remain competitive, requires a fundamental reassessment of priorities. It requires investing in domestic industrial capacity rather than assuming market forces will deliver strategic outcomes. It requires rebuilding the credibility of international institutions rather than dismantling them. It requires developing genuine partnerships with the global South rather than treating developing nations as chess pieces in a great power competition. And above all, it requires the kind of long-term strategic thinking that democracies have historically struggled to sustain, but that the moment urgently demands. The country that quietly won this war did so by understanding a truth that the louder, more dramatic participants missed. In an era of systemic transition, the most powerful thing a nation can do is build while others destroy, invest while others spend, and position for the future while others are consumed by the present. Thank you. I welcome your questions.